Me too. They have to go to the school. She had to go on the next morning, and then she said they couldn't have it really good. She just found out about it.
Oh, from the Facebook post?
Email.
Yeah, I'm glad that we do that so that people can catch it. Yeah. We'll keep it up. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Welcome. Thank you for coming to the Gilford Library today. We're so excited to have Robert Perreault here to talk about Grace Metalious and her heritage and how that's influenced her writing on some of the books that we know and love. This is a New Hampshire Humanities Council program, and so we're grateful to them for supporting programs like this. We've had many of their presentations, and so far, we've loved them all. And I'm excited to hear this one tonight. I've given out the questionnaires. We'll need those filled out before the end of the night if you would. We'll collect them. It's anonymous, and they just love data over there, so they can know what kind of programs to have in the future. So if we can help them out, it helps us out. Tonight we're also recording for Lakes Region Public Access, and it'll go up on our YouTube page, just so you know. So if you didn't want to be seen, don't turn your head around. So thank you very much, Robert, for coming tonight.
I'd like to thank the library staff for having invited me, especially Kaylee, who's not here, I'm sorry, but her assistant.
Yeah, she was here earlier today.
Was here.
She's grateful.
And also I want to thank the New Hampshire Humanities. You see the banner right here. Very important to talk about them because they are a private organization. People think they're government funded. They are not. They're funded by people like yourselves who come to these programs for free, and so they always enjoy having people contribute to them, and so that people like me can come out here and talk. And you will fill out your little evaluation after. Now, I heard someone say, is this a test? I teach conversational French, which has nothing to do with this, but at the end there's going to be an oral test. You have to know how to pronounce Grace Metalious' maiden name, okay? So you listen when I'm speaking, and we'll see at the end if you can pronounce it. So if we can have the lights off. Can everyone see all right? Can everyone hear all right? Okay. A few weeks prior to the publication of her earth-shaking first novel, the author of Peyton Place gave Associated Press columnist Hal Boyle her view of life in a small town. And I quote, "To a tourist, these towns look as peaceful as a postcard picture. But if you go beneath that picture, it's like turning over a rock with your foot. All kinds of strange things crawl out." Published in 1956, Peyton Place shocked and offended some of its readers, and typically its non-readers, by its media-manufactured image as a violent and sexually explicit novel that, for its day, ventured far beyond the bounds of decency. To add to the drama, this story of murder, suicide, rape, and incest had flowed not from the pen of a male writer of racy pulp fiction, but from the mind of a housewife and mother from Gilford, New Hampshire, not too far away, who dared defy her era's feminine conventions by wearing plaid flannel shirts, jeans, and sneakers, not to mention smoking, swearing, and drinking. Critics dismissed Peyton Place as having minimal literary merit. Meanwhile, with some exceptions, the townspeople of Gilmanton, who claimed to recognize themselves and their quaint hamlet in this tell-all tale, ostracized their famous neighbor. Ever since, whenever someone calls a town Peyton Place, people usually understand the term's connotation. This isn't surprising, because the bestseller that contributed that evocative expression to our vocabulary broke all sales records for fiction up to that time, including Gone with the Wind and God's Little Acre. Initially, Peyton Place sold more than 10 million copies worldwide. Only during the paperback revolution of the 1960s and 70s did such blockbusters as To Kill a Mockingbird, Valley of the Dolls, The Godfather, The Exorcist, and Jaws surpass it. 50-plus years later, Peyton Place's estimated sales attained the 20 million mark. Except for another New Hampshire writer's more recent record-breaking opus, that is Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code, no novel since Peyton Place has received as much media attention and raised as many eyebrows. Yet, despite Peyton Place's notoriety, the woman who made it a household name lived and died largely in the shadow of her spicy bestseller that, with its sequel, Return to Peyton Place, spawned 2 Hollywood films and American television's first primetime soap opera. I see evidence of its author's obscure place in literary history each time that, while giving historic tours of Manchester, her hometown and mine, I'm confronted with blank stares when we stop at a 3-story frame house on the northwest corner of Bridge and Ash Streets. Not until I've pronounced the words Peyton Place does the name Grace Metalious, in front of whose earliest childhood home we're standing, begin to stir long forgotten memories. Upon learning that Grace grew up in Manchester, not Gilmanton, people express astonishment. I was ignorant of such local lore until I reached my mid-20s. After all, I was only 5 when Peyton Place was published on September 24th, 1956. Moreover, my parents neither read Peyton Place nor discussed in my presence the controversy that surrounded it. My first exposure to Grace Metalious came in the fall of 1964, 7 months after her death, when the soap opera version of Peyton Place made its debut. Several classmates and I, 8th graders at St. George School, yearned to watch it because our parents considered it suitable for adults only. Rumors circulated about Grace somebody or other, the author of a risque novel upon which this new television series was based, having lived in a Victorian mansion a few blocks from our school. Daily, as I passed by that house, located at the southeast corner of Walnut and Pearl Streets, I wondered what had happened to the author, the only famous person I'd ever heard of who'd supposedly come from Manchester, but whose last name none of us kids could pronounce or remember. I questioned the rumor as, in my adolescent mind, my dull hometown couldn't possibly have given birth to anyone of great importance. Eventually, Peyton Place was canceled, and I forgot about Grace What's-Her-Name. In 1975, sheer coincidence rekindled my interest in Grace Metalious. At a flea market at the Ash Street School, where Grace had studied, I found a hardbound copy of Peyton Place for 50 cents. Within weeks, while working at l'Association Canado-Américaine as librarian archivist I happened upon a folder marked Metalious Grace. Its contents revealed that Grace was born in Manchester, she was Franco-American, and was baptized and married in my childhood parish, where her parents and mine were also married. The more information I uncovered, the more intrigued I became with the genuine person behind the flashy facade of media hype. While scholars and critics might possibly never include Grace's novels among the literary classics, the passage of time should allow present-day readers to reevaluate her works, free from the bias of sensationalism and condemnation that clouded Peyton Place and that eclipsed her other writings. Besides Return to Peyton Place, those lesser-known publications include two novels, The Tight White Collar, in which Grace hints at her Franco-American background, and her autobiographical swan song, No Adam in Eden, a frank, often brutal story based on several generations of her family history from the Quebecois countryside to the New Hampshire millscape, a thinly veiled fictional depiction of Manchester called Livingston. No Adam in Eden includes occasional dialogue in perfect French. True to its title, it shows Grace growing up largely in the company of women. If Grace's lifestyle as an adult clashed with the image of a typical small-town New Hampshire housewife of the 1950s, her childhood bore minimal resemblance to that of a Roman Catholic Franco-American girl growing up in the conservative atmosphere of one of New England's major textile centers. Nevertheless, her connection with her ethnic heritage, however remote, is a revelation that warrants further study to give readers a more complete portrait. Marie Grace DeRepentigny, remember that test. The elder of two daughters of Alfred de Repentigny and Laurette Royer, was born in the old Hôpital Notre-Dame de Lourdes, that is Notre Dame Hospital, demolished in 1976 for the new Catholic Medical Center, in Manchester's Petit Canada, Little Canada, on September 8, 1924. Apart from this, Grace would never have significant contact with the city's Franco-American West Side, which her mother considered beneath her family's status. Since Alfred and Laurette's third-story apartment at 104 Ash Streets lay within the boundaries of St. George Church, they had Grace christened there on September 10th. According to parish records, the pastor, Reverend Thomas J.E. Devoy, later Monsignor Devoy, performed Grace's baptismal ceremony, just as they credit him with having married Alfred and Laurette. Further investigation by research Alfred Marceau offers contradictory evidence regarding Grace's parents' marriage, which casts doubt upon who actually christened her. The May 12, 1924 edition of Manchester's French daily L'Avenir National reveals that Reverend Joseph Ernest Vaccarest, a curate at St. George, performed Alfred and Laurette's wedding ceremony that same day at 6:30 a.m. The early hour was probably due to Laurette's pregnant status. When, in 2005, I interviewed Monsignor Leo St. Pierre, another curate under Monsignor Devoy, he revealed that the pastor always listed himself as officiant at weddings regardless of who had officiated. According to Monsignor St. Pierre, the city of Manchester awarded an annual prize, $25, to whoever married the greatest number of couples in a given year. Monsignor Devoy often won. As for Father Vaccarest, who also eventually became a Monsignor, there is no way of determining whether he might have also baptized Grace as L'Avenir National didn't list christenings at that time. So why should all this matter? Because it establishes a connection between Grace and another New Hampshire Franco-American author, keen-born writer and former Dartmouth College professor Ernest Hebert, whose full name is Joseph Ernest Vaccarest Hebert, dedicated his first novel, The Dogs of March, and I quote, "to the memory of my uncle, Monsignor Joseph Ernest Vaccarest." And he's very proud of that he was connected with Grace Metalious. From May 18th through June 8th, 1958, Grace published a 4-part series entitled All About Me in Peyton Place in the American Weekly, a Sunday supplement wherein, with the same forthrightedness that she employed in her novels, she offered details about her formative years in Manchester. And I quote, "My father and mother are both first-generation Americans, both born in Manchester, New Hampshire, both of French parents. I don't know how much more French I could be and have still been born in the United States. I have to chuckle when people refer to me as a rock-bound New Englander. My maternal grandmother, who lived with us all these years, was growing up, all the years I was growing up, spoke only French, which I learned before I learned English. If there was ever a New Hampshire household that was un-Yankee, it was ours." Indeed, Grace's grandmother, Aglaé Péloquin-Royer, had a profound influence on the young family. In No Adam and Eden, Grace portrays her Mémère Royer via the character of Monique Bergeron as an old-fashioned, domineering, and frigid woman with an obsession for cleanliness. And I quote, "Everyone in town said that Monique Bergeron was the best housekeeper anyone had ever seen, and it was true. But what no one ever realized was the savage anger with which she attacked her chores. There was no love in the care that Monique gave her things. When she polished her furniture, she looked upon each piece as a dangerous enemy, ready to attack her with filth and germs until she had scrubbed and waxed it into sterile submission." According to Grace, her grandmother's attitude toward furniture also extended to men and sex. In an era when most Roman Catholics frowned upon divorce, separation, and desertion, both of Grace's parents came from broken homes. Aglaé ousted her blacksmith husband, Jean Royer, while Grace's paternal grandmother, Florence Marcotte DeRepentigny, there goes that name again, was deserted by Jean DeRepentigny, a painter and iceman. As family breadwinners, both women labored in the Ambuscade mills, thus becoming strong and independent. But they raised their respective children, Grace's parents, to break out of the mill mold. Consequently, Alfred became a skilled pressman who worked at the Granite State Press. When, in 1980, I interviewed him upon his retirement from a 42-year career in the Merchant Marine, he revealed that he'd once been a pressman at L'Avenir National, through which he'd met my maternal grandfather, Adolphe Robert, ACA president and longtime editor of its publication, Le Canado-Américain. And, while employed at the Clark Press, Alfred had known my father, Henry Perreault, a linotype machinist. My father recalled having worked with Alfred de Repentigny, but he was astonished to learn that Alfred was the father of Grace Metalious. By his own admission, Alfred played a passive role in the lives of Grace and her younger sister, Doris May, also called Bunny. He told me that, like his fictional counterpart, Etienne de Montigny, and I quote, "If you read No Adam and Eden, then you know what I mean. I was never around. I worked days, and at night I'd step out. When Grace was very young," and that's a baby picture of her at age 1, "when Grace was very young, I never got involved in baby care or anything. The grandmother, the mère Royer, she was always there seeing to Grace's every need." Although Alfred loved his daughters, he felt misunderstood by Lorette, who belittled him constantly. She considered that she'd married someone beneath her, a blue-collar worker. To Grace, Lorette said, "Your father was an uncouth barbarian who couldn't do anything but make money." Much as her fictional counterpart in No Adam and Eden, Angélique Bergeron de Montigny, Lorette rejected all aspects of her Franco-American working class heritage, most notably the French language, which she saw as a barrier toward achieving the American dream. And I quote, "Angélique was the cleverest girl they had known. She had read all the books that none of them had ever even heard of, and no one in Livingston called her Frenchie. Angélique's Angélique's English had not a trace of an accent, not even when she used words with the horribly difficult TH in them. She could do anything just like an American." According to Grace, in real life, however rarely her mother acknowledged her ethnicity, she enhanced it, claiming French noble lineage. Grace countered bluntly, quote, "My mother's people were Canadian farmers, and the only descendant of nobility to be discerned with the naked eye was my paternal grandfather, whom I saw but once before he deserted my father's mother for the last time." Despite the birth in Paris of either her great-grandfather or her great-great-grandfather DeRepentigny, the nobility of Grace's paternal line remains vague. Grace wrote that her mother harbored impossible dreams such as, and I quote, "Paris trips, and a colonial house with a fanlight over the front door, and a chauffeured limousine, and she never got any of them. People said things like champagne ideas on a beer pocketbook. Who does she think she is? And she always did think she was above the crowd. All the years I was growing up, I heard every cliche ever invented by people with little wants applied to my mother and her big-scale ideas." Even Grace criticized her mother for such practices as buying cheap antiques to pass them off as family heirlooms, or telling people that the family lived in Manchester's posh North End. A year-by-year trace in the Manchester City Directory reveals that, with few exceptions, the DeRepentignys occupied 2- and 3-family houses within walking distance of their original apartment at Bridge and Ash Streets. And I'll show you all the houses they lived in. 104 Ash Street, 3rd floor, 1924-25. 200 Walnut Street, 1st floor, 1926. 251 Pearl Street, 2nd floor, 1927-32. 963 Hanover Street, a single-family rented house, 1933. 283 Bridge Street, 2nd floor, 1934. 40 Arlington Street, east side of duplex, 1935. 753 Beach Street, 2nd floor, 1935-42. The farthest north they lived was this multi-family house at 753 Beach Street on the southeast corner of Beach and Blodgett Streets, since demolished after a fire in the 1990s. Obviously, Grace never occupied the Victorian mansion of my classmates and my adolescent fantasies. Coincidentally, a slight connection to that house does exist. It once belonged to a Harrington family, owners of a liquor business whose descendant, Lawrence Harrington, served as treasurer of the Clark Press, where Grace's father worked. Also, one of Peyton Place's most prominent families is named Harrington. Recognizing hypocrisy in Lorette's thinking, Grace nevertheless understood and sympathized with her mother's thinking, which played a major role in her own decision to become a writer. In real life, as in No Adam and Eden, Mère Royer did most of the housework, thus enabling Lorette to engage in more cerebral activities with Grace and Bunny. Wishing to give her daughters a sense of culture, Lorette read them stories. On her own, Grace devoured the Nancy Drew mysteries, followed by historical and adventure novels. She then graduated to her mother's collection, including works by Dickens and Guy de Maupassant. All this occurred before she reached age 11. By the following year, Lorette had her daughters reading the New York Times Book Review. Whenever her parents argued, Grace would escape and visit her grandmother DeRepentigny, who lived nearby with her daughter, Grace's aunt, Georgiana DeRepentigny McConnell, a physical therapist who worked at home. When, in 1979, I interviewed Aunt Georgie in her apartment at 51 Ash Street, where she'd been living since 1936, she reminisced about her budding author niece, and I quote, "Grace was a reader. She was always with a pencil and a book. She used to spend time at our house when she was a child. I know when she wasn't very old, about 8 years old, she'd take a little stool in my bathtub and she'd soak in there for hours. She'd use the stool to write on, poetry and things like that, funny things that would rhyme about people she knew, Georgie Porgy and stuff like that. She'd be in there and I'd say, 'Come on, get out of there. I got a patient who's got to go in there.' Even when she was married, she'd come here and she'd take a bath and she'd write. You never saw anybody in the world type as fast as she did, for hours. Later on, when she became a writer, she gave me one of her books, The Tight White Collar, and she wrote in it, 'Who else has an aunt like Aunt Georgie?' Although in the 1930s Catholic clergymen still preached against sending children of their faith to public schools, to which many referred as Protestant schools, the DeRepentignys couldn't afford to pay the tuition at l'École Saint-Georges. Therefore, Grace received most of her elementary education at the Ash Street School, directly across from her first childhood home. Within these walls, her imagination, fired by a voracious appetite for reading and by her mother's dreams of a better life, produced the seeds of what would eventually blossom into a literary career. And I quote, "My first real short story was written when I was in the 4th grade. It was entitled My Brother, and I caught hell from the teacher when she read it because I didn't have a brother. 'You made this up,' she screamed. I had to admit that I had, but at the time I hadn't the words to explain that I thought it was much more fun to write about an unreal brother than to write about a boring subject such as my summer vacation or some other dull, true thing." As a 7th grader, Grace penned what she dubbed her first novel, Murder in the Summer Barn Theater, a whodunit in which the culprit turned out not to be the butler, but the actor who played the butler. Apparently at this tender age, she committed herself to her writing. Meanwhile, Alfred could no longer endure living with Lorette. By autumn 1936, when Grace was 12 and Bunny was 10, their father had left their mother. He eventually enlisted in the Merchant Marine and rarely saw his children again. In her American Weekly series, Grace offered the unvarnished truth about her relationship, or lack thereof, with Alfred. And I quote, "In reality, I never knew my father at all. He was just someone who was around the house for a while and then he wasn't. I have never had what most people would call a conversation with him. And today, I don't even know where he is." With her father gone, Grace, as an adolescent, often wrote stories that dealt with the search for a father figure or a male hero who could rescue a young woman in distress and take care of her forever. Her only published short story in her adulthood, Edna Brown and the Charming Prince, which appeared in Glamour magazine in March 1960, revolves around that theme. Despite the above, Grace projected her feelings onto Bunny, declaring, and I quote, "I think it was my sister, who's 25 months younger than I, who minded the lack of my father the most. At the age of 31, she has gone through 3 marriages, 2 of them with men older than she. With my 2-bit psychology, I have often wondered if she has been making a vain search for the father she has never found." Regarding her ethnic identity, Grace combines her own feelings and experiences with those of her mother to describe how Angelique, her mother's fictional counterpart in No Adam and Eden, copes with being a Franco-American adolescent. In one scene, Angelique's French-speaking cousins criticize her for refusing to speak their language, and I quote, "Bien joué, Angelique," they shouted. "I don't want to play with you," Angelique would say, pulling away from their grubby hands. "Regardez," they'd yell, "elle parle anglais, c'est hollandaise." To most French-Canadian children in Livingston, all children who did not speak French were Irish. "Don't be stupid," Angelique would cry and run away and hide. Elsewhere, Angelique further departs from the Franco-American norm of her day, and I quote, "Angelique was graduated from St. George's Parochial School when she was 13, which made her unique in the neighborhood. Most children did not finish grade school till they were at least 14 or, more often, 15 or 16. Another thing that made her unique was the fact that she was going on to high school. So Angelique was enrolled in St. Antoine's High School for Girls." Now this is the real St. Antoine. It's not a fictional. It's the real St. Antoine School in Manchester, but it was co-ed. It wasn't just for girls. But there was a St. George High School for girls. So I think she's using that and fictionalizing the name by using the name of the other one. Anyway, but on the day after her next birthday, she was transferred by her mother to Livingston Central High, which was not only coeducational, but, as French Canadians put it, Protestant. "It was time Angelique had a change," was the only explanation Monique ever gave her outraged relatives. Grace paints a portrait of Livingston High that typifies how many Catholics of the era felt about public schools, a vision that the teaching clergy and even parochial school students themselves reinforced. And I quote, "Livingston Central High School was comprised of 2 big buildings of yellow brick, and over 1,000 boys and girls attended there." "You'll hate it, Angelique," said some of the girls who had attended St. Antoine's High School for Girls with her. "It's so big, you'll get lost. I heard that a girl got in the family way from going to that school. My father says the boys who go to Central are all going to grow up to be gangsters. Only Protestants go there." It was true that Livingston High was big, but that did not disturb Angelique. Everyone at Livingston High spoke English, and English without that terrible Canuck accent of her friends and relatives. Within a month, Angelique had fitted herself into a group. Her girlfriends no longer had French names. Girls named Linda, Martha, and Jane, with last names like Baker, Brown, and Bates. While at Manchester Central High School, Grace adopted habits that reflected her mother's influence. Although her birth and baptismal certificates read Marie Grace DeRepentigny, she told people that her full name was Grace Marie-Antoinette Jeanne d'Arc DeRepentigny, after the French queen and the French saint. Not to mention that she had begun spelling her last name de Repentigny with a small d and the capital R. Normally it was capital D, capital R, and it was all one word, but she split it to give it a more noble appearance. The January 1942 issue of the Oracle, Central High's literary magazine, which also served as the yearbook for Grace's mid-year graduation, features a portrait of a youthful, smiling, optimistic-looking Grace DeRepentigny with a little D-E there, along with her extracurricular activities. And one of those that you might want to pay attention to at the bottom is International Relations Club. We're going to talk about that in a couple seconds. Elsewhere, in the section entitled "The Glamour Girl of 1942B Should Have," it indicates the talkativeness of Grace DeRepentigny. While completing the question, "Can you imagine?" it says, "Can you imagine Grace DeRepentigny keeping quiet anywhere?" The class prophecy declares that in 10 years, Grace DeRepentigny is divorced, but looking toward future happiness with her lawyer, James Drury, who is becoming famous as counsel for the Checker Cab Company. I assume James Drury is a classmate. Oddly enough, among the list of class favorites, next to the category for class writer, 2 names other than Grace appeared. This omission notwithstanding, the November 1942 Oracle, which appeared 10 months after Grace's graduation, contains what is apparently her first published piece, the only one beneath her byline Grace DeRepentigny rather than Grace Metalious. Entitled Fuller Brush Man, it is a brief but poignant story about a man who fled Nazi Germany and who, despite being a brilliant pianist, sells fuller brushes. According to the late Dr. David Stahl, a Manchester dentist and a contemporary of Grace, she modeled Fuller Brush Man upon Ernest Einstein, a well-known Manchester figure. At the time, Einstein, who some believed was related to Albert Einstein, which we have no proof of that, lived at 112 Ash Street, 2 houses north of Grace's first childhood apartment and directly across the street from the Ash Street School. Written with sensitivity, the story demonstrates to what extent Grace had developed her craft at this early stage. Moreover, its publication date, 1942, reflects her youthful awareness of contemporary world events, perhaps because of her membership in the school's International Relations Club, but also due to her mother's influence. During this era, Grace and some friends formed an avant-garde theater troupe, quite an anomaly for Manchester in the 1940s, that staged plays in the basement of the long-since demolished First Unitarian Church across Beach Street from Central High. Grace's first encounter with censorship, a sample of what she would one day endure because of Peyton Place, came at this time. The minister objected to a gay 90s melodrama that Grace had penned. It called for a male actor to appear in women's clothing. Finally, the show did go on, but the minister stayed home. Meanwhile, the church's organist, Robert Athern, and his Franco-American wife, Luce, became involved with the troupe and often hosted rehearsals and parties at their Orange Street home, where Grace discovered another treasured library. In school, Grace received mostly B and C grades, but her teacher in junior English, Louis Friedman, whose son, the late James Friedman, served as president of Dartmouth College, felt that Grace had potential. Grace's Aunt Georgie agreed, and I quote, "I knew she was college material, the way she acted and talked. You never saw a house that had so darn many books. So I said, if you want to go to college and work summers, I'll try to help you." But instead, she got married. Just as her fictional counterpart in No Adam and Eden, Leslie de Montigny, defied her mother by marrying Gino Donati, an Italian-American, Grace married George Metalious, a Greek-American, whom she had met at age 8 while living at 963 Hanover Street, and with whom she became reacquainted at Central High. Their wedding took place on February 27, 1943, in St. George Church, with, again, according to parish records, though no one knows for sure, Monsignor Devoy officiating. Grace's grandmother, DeRepentigny, and Aunt Georgie hosted the reception in their Ash Street apartment, site of our interview nearly 40 years later. From the time of their wedding until 1956, when Grace finally achieved her dream of publication and wealth, the often penniless newlyweds had 3 children and struggled to survive while at various addresses in Manchester and elsewhere. They sometimes lived together, sometimes separately, depending upon the situation, as George fought in World War II and attended the University of New Hampshire both before and after his military service. For a while, they had a 3rd-floor apartment at 111 3rd Street in the old German section of Manchester's West Side. Grace also rented a room at 372 East High Street when George was away studying in Durham. According to the Manchester City Directory for 1952, their last residence in the Queen City was in Crystal Park by the shores of Crystal Lake. Well before the publication of Peyton Place, George's career as an educator had brought the couple to New Hampshire's Lakes region, and that's the house they bought after she made her money from Peyton Place. The first house they lived in Gilmanton was kind of a shack, and she called it It'll Do. So maybe some of you might have known her or visited her. Yes? You did. Did you ever visit this house?
No.
It'll do? No? Okay. For Manchester readers, or for anyone who wishes to make the literary pilgrimage to the Queen City, No Adam and Eden stands out as the most locally oriented of Grace's novels. Besides the corner of Bridge and Ash Streets, St. George Parochial School, St. Antoine's High School for Girls, and Livingstone Central High School, it mentions other landmarks such as Deer Park, which is the Darrowfield Park, the Northeast Manufacturing Company, which is the Amoskeag Mills, the Pilgrim Ice Cream Parlor, which I don't have a photo, unfortunately, which was the Puritan, either the Puritan restaurant at 897 Elm Street or perhaps the Puritan ice cream stand on Daniel Webster Highway. Today it's the restaurant, the Puritan Back Room, but she would not have known that. And undoubtedly, Grace's favorite refuge, the Livingston Public Library, which is the Carpenter Memorial Library. Grace wrote No Adam and Eden shortly before her death, almost in a race against time, as she realized that her years of poverty, followed by more years of riches and partying, had taken their toll. The novel reflects a dark view of life as seen through the eyes of one of its victims, the last of several generations of unfulfilled women. As with many second-generation ethnic Americans of her era, Grace never quite fit into the mold that her cultural heritage had cast for her, nor was she able to completely break from that mold to become part of mainstream American life. In this sense, she closely resembles another Franco-American writer born 2 years before her, some 30-odd miles down the Merrimack River in Lowell, Massachusetts. Jack Kerouac, father of the Beat generation and author of the classic On the Road, also lived a marginal life, caught between two cultures. And, just as with Grace, his bestseller eclipsed his more introspective Franco-American writings, such as Visions of Gerard and Dr. Sachs. Kerouac's excessive lifestyle brought him to the end of his road in 1969 at age 47. But unlike Grace, his literary reputation has since soared to heights that he could never have imagined. As for Grace Metalious, whom those closest to her have described as intelligent, kind, compassionate, and generous, or as a delightful and refreshing girl to be with, and as a bubbly, life-loving young lady, the limelight proved to be a mixed blessing. She had not prepared herself to swallow the bittersweet pill of success, coupled with public scorn, troubled marriages, financial exploitation, and alcoholism, all of which sent her to an early grave by February 25th, 1964, at age 39, not long after having become a proud grandmother. She rests in a remote corner of Gilmanton, New Hampshire's Smith Meeting House Cemetery, where she finally found peace in death that often eluded her in life. The following year, George Metalious and June O'Shea co-wrote a biography entitled The Girl from Peyton Place. But with time, Grace's books went out of print, while she gradually faded from the public's memory. The year 1981 saw the publication of the 25th anniversary edition of Peyton Place, as well as Emily Todd's biographical literary critique, Inside Peyton Place, The Life of Grace Metalious. Still newer editions of Peyton Place in 1999 and Return to Peyton Place in 2007 have appeared through University Press of New England, both with introductory essays by scholar artist Cameron. Novelist Barbara Delinsky also paid homage to Grace in Looking for Peyton Place in 2005. Set in a fictional New Hampshire town, it features a female protagonist who draws inspiration from the spirit of Grace Metalious. In recent decades, colleges and universities have offered courses on women's literature that occasionally highlight Grace as a feminist writer, a label that would perhaps have surprised her and which she might have disputed. In addition, courses, books, films, and public lectures dealing with popular culture of the 1950s usually incorporate the Peyton Place phenomenon, sometimes without mentioning Grace by name. One fact appears obvious. Considering the worldwide sensation that surrounded Grace and Peyton Place in the 1950s, she and her works remain largely unknown among most people born after her death. The 50th anniversary celebrations of both the novel and the film versions of Peyton Place in 2006 and 2007 respectively somewhat jogged the public's dormant memory of Grace Metalious. Manchester Central High School's, whose Hall of Fame includes Grace, organized a 50 Years of Grace festival and reprinted The Fuller Brush Man in the Oracle. The town of Camden, Maine, where Peyton Place was filmed, held a Grace Metalious weekend. Meanwhile, speculation about a film project on Grace's life featuring Sandra Bullock in the starring role also captured the public's attention, but nothing has been done about that so far, and it's been over 10 years. Finally, on a humorous note, the New Hampshire Historical Society issued a Grace Metalious figure in its bobblehead series. So she's along there with General John Stark and Franklin Pierce and our old friend Fritz Weatherby. You know you've made it when you're with Fritz Weatherby. Or maybe he's made it because he's with Grace Metalious. At the very least, after more than half a century, Grace's writings, which many readers now agree are of a much higher quality than originally thought, deserve the serious critical analysis that she so desperately sought, but which the reactionaries of her era succeeded in denying her. Dreamer that I am, I long to see a memorial erected in honor of Manchester's famous novelist. And so far they've named a back alley, just a back alley, Grace Metalious Lane. I envision a statue modeled after Larry Smith's Peyton Place dust jacket photo entitled Pandora in Blue Jeans, and that's this right here. In my dreams, this statue sits at the northeast corner of Bridge and Ash Streets on the grounds of the former Ash Street School where Grace learned to love reading and writing. The corner also faces her first childhood home and is diagonally across from where the Fuller Brush Man lived. In No Adam and Eden, Angelique always met her boyfriends at that corner. On the statue's base, a plaque would read, Grace DeRepentigny Metalious, born September 8, 1924 in Manchester, New Hampshire, died February 25, 1964 in Boston, Massachusetts. Author of Peyton Place, Return to Peyton Place, The Tight White Collar, and No Adam and Eden. And below that inscription, there's a poem called Pandora in Blue Jeans, which I would donate to the city. It's not once, not twice, but more than thrice. She told the truth, left out the sugar, but not the spice. Some said uncouth, others said not nice. And in the end, they all made sure she'd pay the price. Since time has passed, we fought the fight to let them know that she was right. And now at last, she's won her place, So here's to you, our amazing Grace. I'll entertain questions.
Did she live in Gilford at one time?
She lived in Gilmanton. I don't know that she ever lived, I've never heard that she lived in Gilford.
I thought she lived in Gilford for a little bit.
The only place, in her biography, it says 2 places in Gilmanton. I know you'd like her to have lived there. I'm sorry. Some people might not have liked her to live here too. You know, I've found that people, you know, the generations that objected to her have now pretty much disappeared, I think, or are so on in years that they're just not complaining anymore. Because I even gave this talk in Gilmanton, and there were about 125 people in the audience. So they're interested, and they didn't throw tomatoes at me. So they were enthusiastic. So.
She was a woman ahead of her time.
Way ahead of her time. Oh yeah, and that was probably one of the problems.
That was
one of the problems because she, you know, whenever you're ahead of your time, you know, it's not necessarily good. So unless you're Leonardo da Vinci or something.
Did they perform an autopsy on her in terms of the back closet death?
I don't think they needed to be honest. She was
pretty obvious.
She was, yeah, it was pretty obvious. She was really heavily into it. She and Jack Kerouac both, because I do another talk on Jack Kerouac like this. These people were drinking like a quart of hard liquor a day. And it was, you try it and see how long you live. So,
I'm not cirrhosis.
anyone else? Yes.
You mentioned there are just 2 biographies that are in existence.
Right now, yes, there are 2 biographies. There are some other books, but they're not biographies. There's one that analyzes, it's called Unbuttoning America, and it kind of analyzes the whole Peyton Place phenomenon. Like, why did Peyton Place make such a sensation? Because today, if Peyton Place came out, it would be just another novel, you know, compared to everything else that's out there. Whereas in its day, it was revolutionary, shockingly revolutionary for the people of the 1950s who were accustomed to whatever, Andy Griffith and
Father knows best.
you know, Maynard Krebs was probably the wildest thing on TV.
Yeah.
Yes.
What happened to her children?
Aha! I was
Yeah,
wondering
that's-
when somebody was going to ask that question. I've never given this talk without somebody asking about the children. The children, as far as I know, are all still alive, and they're all retired. I met all 3 at one time or another. In fact, in Gilmanton, about 3 years ago, I think it was, they had a Grace Metalious celebration, and they invited the 3 children, the oldest daughter, Marcia, and the son, Christopher, were there, and so I met them. And I had also met Marcia in 2007 with her sister Cynthia, the youngest, when I said they filmed Peyton Place there in Camden, Maine, and so they had a 3-day celebration and they were there. So I met them there. And Marcia also appeared, I don't know if you would remember this, but when Fritz Weatherby was still the host of, what is it, New Hampshire Crossroads, they did, pardon?
Chronicle?
Now,
Oh.
I'm talking, that's why I said, do you remember,
Oh.
back in the 90s, he was host of New Hampshire Crossroads on Channel 11, you know, that, out in Durham. They had done an entire half-hour show on Grace Metalious. Okay, so I was in the show for like 30 seconds. But Marcia was in the show, and George, her husband, was in the show. So, you know, and in that program, it ends. It's really poignant the way it ends. They ask Marcia, "Do you forgive your mother?" And she says, for what? And then it goes to a freeze frame, and that's how it ends. So, because there were accusations of her neglecting her children, that in order to write, because they said her writing was like, it was like an obsession. The sink was just full of dirty dishes all the time, and the kids were eating peanut butter and jelly sandwiches. And that's what's been written. Now, I wasn't there, so I don't know. I'm just saying that's what was written. Could you talk about what was your relationship with Grace?
It wasn't very big.
Yeah.
I mean, I was 13 or 14
Right.
at the time, and
Yeah.
my parents knew her,
Yeah,
and I do remember that they worried about her alcoholism. And
Yeah.
I knew where she lived. I knew my parents had gone to a party at the house, and I remember her in her plaid shirts running around town with T.J. Martin.
Oh, okay.
I remember that part of it, and
Was he the radio?
he was
Yes,
the radio
radio
guy.
guy.
He was the radio. TJ the DJ.
Yep, and a friend of my parents was a lawyer, and he tried to protect her as much.
Snyerson?
Sneerson.
Sneerson.
Yes.
Okay.
But I do remember, the thing I remember was after her death, my father was on the public library board in Laconia, and he tried to get Peyton Place into the library, and they very kindly asked him to leave the library.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, a lot of libraries. It was banned in Canada. It was banned in Rhode Island. Whatever.
But she was larger than life
Yeah.
in Laconia.
Yeah, and William Loeb, if
Oh,
you remember
yeah.
William Loeb,
Yeah.
had written one of his famous page 1 editorials, "The Filth They Live By." That was the title of the editorial. So, but the Manchester Library did have it. So.
Yeah, Laconia did not, and
Yeah.
I do remember in 9th grade a teacher suggesting that we read Peyton Place because her character studies were brilliant.
Yeah.
And as a grown-up, I went back and I read it, and it's absolutely
Yeah.
true. She developed characters
Yeah.
that were outstanding.
Yeah. Did you know Laurie Wilkins, by the way?
No,
You didn't.
well,
Because
if-
Laurie Wilkins was a journalist for the Laconia citizen who had interviewed Grace even before. She knew her anyway. She helped her out. She would feed her stories, like the famous sheep pen murder, that took place in Gilmanton Ironworks, which was the one story that really upset the people of Gilmanton because it was a true story.
Yeah.
It had really happened.
well,
So-
most of Peyton Place was true.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
And
that's
Laurie
based on
Wilkins,
real people.
Laurie Wilkins would, but she situated it on the Connecticut River, and I gave this talk in Lebanon once, and the people of Lebanon said, please tell us Peyton Place is us. They wanted it to be. Gilmanton did not want it to be, but they wanted it to be.
I do remember the movie premiere with Lana Turner.
Yeah.
Was in Laconia.
Yeah,
And I remember them polishing the brass on the Colonial Theater and cleaning it like
Yeah.
it had never been cleaned.
Right.
We watched it.
Sure.
And, I sneaked
Yeah.
out on my bicycle to come watch it.
out of curiosity, how many of you have read Peyton Place? Okay, how many of you read it when you were teenagers?
I might have, like, I remember.
Oh, you would remember, come on.
I was 16 when it came out, so I know I didn't read it then. But maybe when I got
And the
married
three
at
that you
19,
might have.
I might have read it.
Because the classic story is teenagers would get it somehow, either from friends or whatever,
Yeah.
and they'd keep it in their locker at
Yeah.
school
Yeah.
because they didn't want their parents to know.
Oh dear.
And then the principal would find out that there were kids reading this, and that they had all the pages where some kids weren't even reading the novel, they were just reading the scenes.
Oh,
the
all
famous
three
scenes.
of them.
All three of them, yes, she knows, and the page is dog-eared, so you know exactly
Well,
where and all that.
I hate to tell you, I was 13 or 14, and my father gave me the book.
Really?
To read.
Well, your father was pretty progressive.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, I mean, or
Maybe that was a way to tell you about things that he was too shy to tell
he
you.
said
Here,
it
read
was
it.
a local author
Yeah.
and that I should be proud.
Had he read it?
Oh, yeah,
Oh, yeah.
he also gave me.
Well, then, he was very progressive.
Yeah, I mean.
Now, here's a question. How many of you here, when you read it, way back, were Roman Catholic? Did you all go to confession? And I'm dead serious. There were priests who said, if you read, they were saying this from the pulpit, if you read Peyton Place,
They were both set with me.
it was a mortal sin.
It was a sin.
It was a mortal sin, so you had to go to confession. So I hope you all went to confession and got absolution.
Oh, okay.
Because I don't want to be accused of giving a talk to an audience of sinners, okay?
Yep.
Anyway, yes.
I'll go to my deathbed.
Her Aunt Georgie seemed fond of her.
She
and
was.
Did she talk about any disgrace or any backlash?
No, she was very positive. She just, well, I'll tell you one thing though. She said, Grace gave her one copy, just one book, The Tight White Collar, and she said, I didn't read it because I'm a moral person, and I was told that we don't read those things. And the thing is, The Tight White Collar is nothing compared to Peyton Place, and you know, it's so. You read it?
Yeah.
I read it.
Did anybody read No Adam and Eve? That's the one no one reads.
I only read one.
And it's hard to find today because the other two, the Peyton Place and Return to Peyton Place have been, reissued several times. The Tight White Collar has not, and neither has No Adam and Eden. But No Adam and Eden, if you really want to know about Grace and what she was all about, and Manchester, it's called Livingston, but still, that's the book to read, and that's the hardest one to find. But it's the one that most of my information here, and the quotes and all that, are based on. So, if you can find it through the internet, you can get copies. I've had a couple of libraries where they surprised me. I show up at the library, and I say, anybody read No Adam and Eden? And all these hands go up, and I say, it's so hard to find. And the librarian says, I went on the internet and I scooped up as many copies as I could, and I had people read it. They have their reading groups, so that's the one. If you can find a copy.
So we have to ask for that?
Yes. Well, I'm not sure. I have to look to see if we've got it.
Yeah.
I bet we do. I'll find out.
Yes.
What year was it that Barbara Walters came to Wilmington Ironworks? That was, I remember watching that on TV where she had the librarian there right in front of the Wilmington Ironworks library and said, you don't have a book, you don't have a copy of the book in the library, so let me give you one.
Yeah.
And the librarian was just like,
Yeah.
I'm
sorry, I don't remember that. I remember the incident, but to say I remember the exact year.
Was it the 90s or 80s?
Possibly. I don't think it was the 90s. It would have been more.
Are you going to publish a biography?
Pardon?
Are you going to publish a biography?
Well, I'm glad you asked.
Because I think you should, with all this that you have.
I was going to forget. I always forget. I'm my own worst. I wrote this book. It's a book on the Franco-Americans of Manchester. And there's a chapter in here on Grace Metalious. There are chapters on other people from Manchester as well, and a general history of the Franco-Americans of Manchester. And if anybody's interested, I have a few copies, so I can see you afterwards for that.
I'm a Franco-American from Lowell.
You are? So you know Jack Kerouac?
Yes, I do.
You do.
Not
What's your
personally.
name? Well, I didn't think personally. These people, by the way, these people would be in their 90s today, if they were alive. So,
My maiden name was Desmarais.
Desmarais. Okay.
Je parle français.
Oh, c'est très bien.
Je comprends mieux que je parle.
Okay, no, vous parlez très bien. I just told her she speaks very well. Anybody else?
I'm Franco-American.
You are?
Yeah, first generation American.
Really?
My
Okay.
father was from Canada.
Your name?
Doris Marcoux.
Marcoux, yeah. Okay. All right, great.
We just had our
Oh, by the way,
ancestry done.
okay. we're gonna start a
98% French.
contest, we're gonna start a contest here.
2%
I want you to
American.
repeat, what's Grace's maiden name?
DeRepentigny.
Almost.
DeRepentigny.
Oh, okay.
DeRepentigny.
Yeah, DeRepentigny. It's that GN sound that's nya, 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 like Curly from the Three Stooges, nya, nya, nya. DeRepentigny, okay? So, anyway. Anyway, no, it's a tough name, believe me.
Well, thank you again, Robert, for coming out
All right.
tonight. It's wonderful.